All right. Good morning, everyone. So, just a few things I wanted to start off with. I've been sending you information about preparing for the actual review article, which we will talk about today. I have heard from at least one professor and one student from this course that sometimes it can be difficult to open up my attachments. And it appears to be specific to the Outlook account that I have, because when I send the same attachments via my personal Gmail, I don't have this problem. So if you get an email with an attachment and you can't open it, just let me know so that I can use a different email to be able to contact you. I have in the past tried to use my personal Gmail to be able to communicate with classes, but I sometimes get blocked because it's an external email going into university email. And so it's a problem. So, you know, just I am patient with you guys. Please be patient with me if a situation like this happens, because I don't want there to be a lack of communication about certain things. One of the things that I really want you to have is feedback. So I've given everyone feedback on their first assignments, generally quite strong. Um, what I want to see more from people is really diving into the critical thinking, the analysis of the literature that you are assessing in order to construct your own perspective, but also your own conclusions about things. And so, as part of that, has to do with how you arrange your writing so that you can speak to this in a very clear, well delineated fashion. So, clear paragraphs with a very specific topic, and then there is actual coherence between one topic transitioning into another. Right. And so we're going to actually talk about many of these things in our discussion today as we prepare as a team in the manuscript that we will do. Before we get too deeply into this, I want to introduce Louis Delano, who is a graduate student, and he's going to be helping in the development of this manuscript, giving you guys his personal insight into working with the protein that is the subject of our review. So, Louis, if you can just briefly introduce yourself and just briefly talk about your research.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Louis. I'm a graduate student at the Department of Chemistry of University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, and I'm currently working with Dr. Kai and Dr. Tinoco as my advisors. And I've been working with Cytochrome C for quite some years now. So the professor proposed me to work with you guys on a review that he will be um, supervise you on, and he asked me to work with you guys. So I will be glad to do so because I think I've been, I know some about this protein. Um, Basically, my work as a graduate student is focused on, formulation of cytochrome C as a protein that has some potential as a can, cancer killing agent. Well, I'm saying not specifically cancer, but cancer cell. I would say because this protein normally is present in all eukaryotic cells, and it is normally used to induce when it's released in the cytosol. It is used to induce um, apoptosis. And cancer cell, the scenario is it's quite different because sometimes this release is stopped. So my project is my project hypothesis is what will happen if we deliver exogenous cytochrome C to the cytosol of this cancer cell so we can induce it. But the problem with cytochrome C has it's not a protein. It cannot enter cells by itself. So you need some type of formulations to, you know, to allow it to enter the cell. So my work is based on that. Use some formulations and deliver the cytochrome C and finally induce apoptosis to kill cells. So
All
I
right.
will be glad, guys, to work with you. So let's see how it happens, how it will go.
All right. Well, thank you, Louis. So Louis is quite humble about having some insight into protein. He has worked with different formulations to really try to optimize the delivery of this protein. So that, as an introduction, he highlighted a really important thing, which and Manoj also talked about, which is that this protein lacks cell permeability. And so you need to develop a vehicle, whether it's biomolecular or some sort of biocompatible agent that can facilitate its delivery. All right, so what I want to talk about is a bit about the writing process, because one of the things about being a scientist is being able to communicate and communicate effectively and concisely. So let's talk a bit about that. All right, so we're going to focus on the construction of a perspective review article for publication. And the thing is that what I'm going to talk about doesn't necessarily pertain to just a perspective review article, although there will be things that are specific to this type of manuscript. So let's go through this little flow chart that I've created, and there are obviously different ways that you can actually enter into this pathway. So basically, when you are preparing yourself to write a manuscript for publication, you have to be quite familiar with the literature. So whether this is going to be a discussion of research that you've done personally, or if it's an assessment of work that you're providing your own review for, you have to have a background that defines your level of comprehension and that allows you to be able to think critically about the material. The next thing is, now that you have your collection of literature, is to actually develop the story. And so science writing is not, and there tends to be a bit of a mistake, and I think that comes from how people are taught laboratory courses where you simply report what you observe. And when you get into upper level courses, there is the level of critical analysis. But still, there tends to be a disconnect between the significance of the work that you're reporting and conveying that. So you have to think about the manuscript that you're crafting as an actual story that you're trying to tell. And you need to be very clear about how this is going to be conveyed to other people, because the reader doesn't possess the level of skill or knowledge that you have that you're facilitating. And so you have to think about what is the reader capturing and understanding. And to some extent, put yourself in your footsteps when you were just beginning. What enabled you to have that comprehension. So in the development of your story, you have to think about the visuals that you're going to use to convey what it is that you're trying to say. And so visuals really do have a major impact. So this goes into the drafting of the manuscript. You need to have your collection of visuals in mind, if not necessarily developed yet, so that you know how you're going to go from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3, if you want to think about it in that context. As part of this, you also want to consider the journal that you are going to submit to, because the journals will have a specific scope that you need to see if your actual manuscript fits within. And you also have to look at the templates that they provide you in order to be able to prepare your manuscript according to their guidelines. And so here, there could be a different way that you can enter. Whereas, let's say that someone actually invites you to submit a paper, right? So there, you don't necessarily have to think about the journal. If you have the expertise and the material, then you go ahead and start crafting your manuscript to the invitation. Okay. In this context of how we're preparing our manuscript, it is something that I found in a call for a paper. Okay, and that isn't always the case. Sometimes you can submit your own manuscript to a journal as long as it fits within the scope, or you find a specific call, which is what I did here, is so that we could submit our manuscript. Okay, so once you draft your manuscript in the fashion of the journal and you submit it, then it goes through the process of peer review. So here, there are a number of steps involved where you have the editorial board that takes a look at the manuscript and can just, by looking at the title and the, I guess, the abstract, can tell whether or not the article fits the scope of the journal. So you might actually get a rejection right from the very start without it going forward to the next steps of what constitutes peer review. So there are a number of steps here. If the editor or editorial board thinks that this does fit the scope of the journal, they will move it forward to a panel of reviewers, which you can have a hand at selecting or suggesting. Okay, so depending on the input from the peer review process, you can potentially have the opportunity to revise your manuscript so that it can be considered further. Okay, and if you successfully manage through the revision process, then you have the publication. And so here, you still have additional parts where you still have to revise, make sure that you don't have errors in your figures, that the person who is actually typesetting the manuscript hasn't made a mistake in that process. So that also involves quite a bit of time. But very importantly is promoting the work, because the objective is not just to submit and be done with it. It is actually to get your work out there and to be quite visual, right? So use social media, email your manuscript if it's allowed by the journal to do so. And that's a very key thing, is getting cited, getting recognized, because you don't want to just put something out there and that's the end of the day. It is because you actually want to reach out to an audience. And so you have to participate in this process of promoting the work. All right, so let's talk about what is a perspective review. And so there is a misconception about a review being a report. So a report is something that you would normally submit in a class to just talk about, a collection of observations or findings that pertain to a particular subject. And you may have some amount of your own analysis, but really it's just reporting what you have actually read. Whereas a perspective review, or reviews in general, are a type of investigation. And you're actually critically analyzing contributions to a particular field. So you have to elucidate a problem that different research teams are tackling. And the thing is that, as this not being a report, what you don't want to do is simply do a laundry list or a grocery list reporting of findings. All right, so you don't want to say, oh, in paper so-and-so, they saw this, and then in this other paper, they saw that, and then there's no coherence. You are actually taking the contributions made in these different manuscripts, and you're putting them together to provide an analysis to say what major contributions are coming out from this. What trends do we observe that others have not observed? And so as part of this, you're actually focusing on a collection of published work, so a certain collection of published works. And in a moment, we'll talk about which specific works you really want to focus on. You want to give insight into the current status of the field, and then, as part of this manuscript, highlight the major advances of the field. So as a consequence of this, you will have to become familiar with the older and current literature, and something that can help with the older literature, but you want to be cautious about this, is perhaps any reviews that may exist that gives you a little bit of an understanding of what people thought at a certain time. And then a really key factor in all of this is that you want to highlight the significance of the field, but in terms of where your perspective comes in, is identify new research directions for the field. That typically would be the cap-off of the manuscript. All right, so then how do we tackle the writing process of a perspective review? So to an extent, I've helped you in this process because this is only a one-semester course, so it is not feasible to have you take the lectures and then try to come up with something that can potentially be something that will be publishable. So I did some initial steps by consulting with Lewis and a number of other people about what would be a worthwhile topic that a number of students can contribute to. So to an extent, I already did some of the initial footsteps. But you also have to consider developing a certain extent of expertise. And so that is becoming familiar with the key players. So that's what I was saying to you about the selection of articles, published articles, is based on work that's coming from people that are contributing in a major way to the field. So when I say read, and read some more, I do really mean that. I want you to have a pretty strong understanding of the material and critically assess the experimental approaches taken, identify accomplishments, and where applicable, identify limitations. And by limitations, I don't necessarily mean trying to, nitpick things that are flaws in a study, because every study will have its issue. It's a building of different ideas, of different findings, to try to, tackle certain problem. So what you want to do is just to highlight something that perhaps needs to also be considered. And so I highly emphasize that you don't want to, in your writing, to attack or offend anyone. Pointing out a limitation of like something that needs to be further addressed, that's fine. But not say, oh, so-and-so did not do this effectively, boo them. And that's not something you want to do, because you definitely get blacklisted in the field. Also, become familiar with these people. So it's not just that you're reading their manuscripts. Actually, look at their websites and contextualize their work by seeing, what does their lab consist of? Who are the people in this lab? Why are they actually doing this work? What type of funding do they have that's propelling them to do this research? So when working with others, and so as you will be doing and working as a team, compare your notes. So I do suggest that there be some amount of overlap in the reading that you guys will do. You are working in separate teams, but even within your teams, there'll be some division of labor. But I highly suggest that you find common material to read so that you guys can compare your different opinions in order to feed into your own individual critical assessment. Because often seeing what other people see can help you to maybe reevaluate perhaps a misconception you have, or maybe actually helps to affirm something you believe very strongly. How do you decide on what literature to focus on? So you begin by outlining the topics of interest for your perspective review. So a perspective review is meant to be a very focused study, not general. You identify the key topics that you can effectively analyze and that you can say something that is, let's say, perhaps unique or that adds a refreshing spin to the general commentary. And so this is very important. And, in this regard, I've actually have helped you guys out because I've actually prepared an outline. What I don't want you to think is that outline is the final word. It is mostly a suggestion of how you can start constructing your manuscript in ways that can lead to probably something that would be interesting and perhaps different. So gather a collection of topics for a collection of articles for the topics of interest. And what I would do to help you in this process is have you guys prepare what is known as an annotated bibliography. So unlike just a normal bibliography with just a listing of references, an annotated bibliography is one in which you actually read the literature and then you write an assessment, a very brief assessment. But the thing is that the collection of articles that you have used to develop your annotated bibliography, they're meant to be interrelated, such that when you write your bibliography and your little assessment, in your subsequent entries, you talk about how a previous article helps you to understand something better or builds upon an idea. So that is what the concept of an annotated bibliography. It helps you to really expand your comprehension, and so that you can see the connectivity in what's being published. And I highly recommend is to focus on primary references. What I mean by that is actual research papers. You can refer to review articles, as I said, to help you develop a perspective of what people thought at a certain given time. But do not follow and basically plagiarize the review article for the construction of your own review article, because clearly your perspective would be completely lost, and then we will have issues of plagiarism that we would have to deal with. Okay, so again, review articles are very good for helping you to contextualize the work, especially at a given time. But the way you're going to develop your own perspective is by really tackling the primary literature. Another really important thing, and I see this happen a lot, but less so, especially for students in this course, do not cite a paper that mentions a point that is actually not the main focus of the manuscript. And so I'll give you an example. So for example, let's say you're reading a paper about gold-3 chemistry, and the author briefly mentioned that the Chinese used gold therapeutically thousands of years ago. Okay, so that may be a brief mention, but if the article is strictly about gold, let's say coordination chemistry, then this article would not be a good article to reference about the discussion of gold in traditional Chinese medicine. It would just be inappropriate. But it often happens that just because someone read one sentence that said something about a certain theme, that reference becomes what is used in the paper, or excuse me, in a manuscript, and it's actually really inappropriate, because whatever the focus of that paper is has nothing to do with the, what it's getting referenced for. So instead, if you like a certain thing that you think might contribute to your manuscript, search for an article that actually talks about that point of interest. Sorry about that. And so as part of the annotated bibliography, but even more so, prepare your library of references. So what I want everyone to use is a software, and this software is EndNote, and so I have access to it. You guys are welcome to use things that are in my student office and for my laboratory. I want everyone to prepare a library of references that they'll put into an EndNote library, because at the end of the day, when we collect all the different writings, we need to be able to easily pull the references in order to assemble the final draft. So the easiest way to do this is to have a library. So this is a software that will preserve everyone's references, so that I don't have to retype anything, or someone doesn't have to, reformat. The software allows you to convert to whatever format is specific to a journal. And that is the beauty of it, because it really helps you to be quite efficient, and it also helps you to be organized. All right. So how to work in a team on a perspective review? Well, again, this is a virtual course, and that's not necessarily in how this course was designed, but that is what we're living in. That doesn't mean that you guys cannot interact. You guys have the freedom to interact with one another, obviously without me being there. So really get to know one another, and be open to intellectual discourse, and be open to perhaps some criticism in terms of maybe how you see something from an article. Okay, so by communicating with one another, you're able to clarify your doubts, right? Because you guys are the ones that be reading that particular literature. I may be able to help you, but if I haven't read a paper, perhaps I wouldn't be the best person to, clarify a doubt of a specific experiment in a paper. Don't be afraid to say, I don't get this, please explain. That's a really key thing to seek out help. As I mentioned before, try to overlap in the material that you read so that there's some common foundation. Discuss and compare your critical assessment. That's going to be a very important thing, because that will help you to identify your perspective, that thing that's going to make this paper worthy of publication and worthy of people citing you. So don't be afraid to say, I don't agree with you, because this is just a perspective of how you see something versus another, and it may be that no one's actually wrong, right? So differences in opinions greatly add to the presentation of different trains of thought, because we actually want to see that, and even in the disagreements that exist already in the literature. So for instance, when I was talking to you guys about serum transfer and transport of iron within the cell, I mentioned to you guys that there's actually a disagreement in terms of how the iron is actually released from the transferrin receptor derived endosomes. So this is a protein that is well studied, but even something that's so well studied, there are things that people do not agree on, and that's perfectly fine. It's actually very interesting to highlight those moments where there is a disaccord in terms of an understanding of a phenomenon. All right. How to incorporate visuals, and that's a big thing, because as I mentioned to you, you want to tell a compelling story, and oftentimes just using words would not be sufficient. Right? So take advantage of images, as they can help you to really convey something much more effectively, or in a complementary fashion. I highly suggest to prepare your own figures, and so have access to software like ChemDrawer, PowerPoint. PowerPoint actually allows for really nice visuals to be made. Adobe Illustrator, Pimo. Something that I encourage students a lot is always pre-size your figures. So what do I mean by pre-size? I mean, if you know the size that you want it to be in your actual final draft of your manuscript, then make your figure that size. Don't make it some random size that you then at the end have to reorganize to fit the manuscript, because sometimes you will lose the resolution or the clarity will not be there, perhaps because of choice of font size and things like that. So always pre-size your figures. Prepare tables where necessary. So this is actually a really important one, because again, this is an investigation. So perhaps there is data that's available in the literature, or it may be in some reference, some encyclopedia reference, and you might want to present the data in a certain way that has not been shown before to convey a trend that maybe people haven't seen. And so that's actually really important, because to understand that you are still capable of analyzing and producing a way of seeing data that was collected by other people. Now, if you want to use published figures, and I encourage that, I don't think that's a bad idea, especially any primary data, okay, because that's something you can't produce your own figure for. Well, you must obtain copyright permission. And so every journal or every publisher allows us to know what are their guidelines for gaining that copyright permission. And I can, in a separate meeting with you guys, show you this process. So sometimes there is a cost for including a figure that has been published. And so we have to use our judgment in terms of, is a figure worthy, that important that we want to include it? Or is it simply, something that you can probably make your own figure? So here you have to kind of balance, the need for the figure and the cost, because sometimes it can be a little bit expensive. Now, in terms of cost, don't worry about any payments. I will take care of paying for the use of figures, for the publishing of the manuscript, because none of this is going to be free. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Publishing papers, there are journals that are free, but there are several other journals, especially the high impact ones, the Science, the Nature. Those journals cost a lot of money to publish in. So I will supply the funds, whether through my own grants, or if I can find some internal grants or external grants to be able to pay for the publication and whatever figures that we end up using. But that'll be my responsibility, not yours. So you don't have to worry about that, work extra hours as a waiter or something like that. All right, but then how to prepare the manuscript. So journals often have templates that you must use to construct the final form of your manuscript. So often that's actually quite helpful, because then you can pre-organize your manuscript in a way that, can more effectively sell your paper to the editorial board. If they can see it in the format that they already encourage, that's quite helpful. And so you prepare the manuscript in the order required by the journal. Keep in mind that there are often page, character limits, and even limits in the number of figures. At least for the journal that we're going to be publishing in, there actually isn't a limit in that regard. All right, but you want to be reasonable. So you don't want to write a paper that is so long and tedious that no one's going to actually read it. So you want to keep it within a certain length that it is actually readable. At least if they can read it in parts, that would be useful. You want to prepare a captivating title. And so I've actually provided everyone with a reference about the components of a manuscript and what to think about to be effective in really fulfilling those components. So I'm just giving you the highlights, at least from my perspective. Preparing a captivating title, because the effective storytelling starts with the title. You write a compelling abstract. So here you want to be quite careful, because sometimes abstracts can, people are taught to make it just a list of results. But an abstract is not supposed to be entirely, information heavy. It's supposed to be a mixture of, being concise and informative, but also conveying the significance of the project. But this is supposed to be in as few words as possible. So really avoid just giving a laundry list, again, a grocery list of results, because that is actually not helpful, especially when I mentioned to you, when you're trying to convince an editorial board to move your paper over for peer review. If they just see a list of results, but there's no, understanding of what that means, it's not helpful. Now you want to establish the focus of review in the introduction. So the introduction is your primary way to bring the background literature that defines the significance of the work of your project. So again, you contextualize the significance of the review's subject matter. You identify the key topics that will be elaborated on. So you make that very clear that this review manuscript, we're going to talk about topic A, topic B, topic C. Okay. And you want to briefly present what new insight you will be providing, but very briefly, because you want to have them, wanting more, wanting to find out what more do you have to offer. So effectively lay out your story in the discussion and conclusion sections. Arrange your story in a coherent collection of topics. So as part of this, what I don't want to see is papers in which you just have this was the results from paper A. This was the results from paper B. This was the result from paper. That's not how you write a review. You actually have a certain topic, and you discuss manuscripts that contribute to that topic. And as part of that, you will present the data and the analysis. So never say that in this paper we see this. No, you will refer to the team of researchers, and you will say they did this experiment and they observed this result, which this result tells us about certain trend or certain phenomenon. So you highlight key accomplishments and even limitations and describe how they further the field. So that subsequent sections must build on from previous ones. Again, that idea of maintaining a coherent collection of your actual perspective. Then you have your conclusion. You conclude with an overview of all the topics discussed, while focusing on your collective vision and what research avenues need further exploration. All right, so again, the end goal is not simply to say, we talked about all this stuff and that's it. The end goal is just to say that we highlighted these things, and these things say something really important about the field, and there's more that can be evaluated, and you can make those suggestions of what more can be evaluated now that you have that expertise to be able to do so. And then there's a section called the acknowledgements. And even though there's a review, I believe it's also very important in the acknowledgement to recognize any sources of funding that is providing you with research funds. Many of you do have research funds, and so that actually is important to highlight. Recognize people that have provided you with direct input or feedback. So there's someone who is not an author on the paper. Here's where you only put authors. You don't put any authors from the paper. But if you talk to somebody and they gave you some really insightful information, well, put them in this acknowledgement. That's the right thing to do. All right. So that goes into the construction of the manuscript, right? But then there's that level of preparing for peer review or submitting for peer review. And so it starts with writing an effective cover letter. So here, the cover letter is what you are going to present to the editor in addition to your manuscript. But here is a letter where you are going to tell them why this work is important and why it must be published in their journal. Okay, you got to make that connection for them. And depending on the journal, you may even suggest an editor on the editorial board that is fit to evaluate your work and that will help to improve upon it. And you also make recommendations, typically at least 3 referees, with the expertise to properly examine your work. Now, there are times where they'll ask you, is there anyone that you don't want to evaluate your work? And you can write someone's name, you can say why. Right? I have never done it. I've never had a reason to not want to show my work to somebody else. There are always going to be competitors in the field, right? And that's just the nature of the game. And sometimes it's actually quite inspiring. So I have never done it. People have. There could be people that are just, they don't like each other's work, so that might be a conflict, and so they want to avoid that person reading the work and possibly giving a negative review. prepare an interesting but simple table of contents graphical abstract. So this journal asked for one. And so here you're basically preparing a visual of one of the first things, in addition to the title, that they're going to see that's going to capture the idea of the manuscript. So it's supposed to be small, so you don't want to overstuff this figure. All right, you want to just give the most a simple but really impactful image. All right, so before we officially move on to discussion of the manuscript, all right, I want to ask you guys, do you have any questions about the process of constructing a manuscript and the peer review process? Any doubts, questions about that? And again, feel free to write questions in the chat. I can see your comments there as well. All right, so I'm going to continue on because I want to talk about the actual manuscript that we're going to focus on. But again, you can still ask me a question about the actual process, and then so that we can all clarify our doubts there. All right, so here's just a working subject. It doesn't actually have to be the title of the paper, but it's just to give us an idea as to what we're going to build. And so we're going to, through this manuscript, explore different drug delivery approaches for the development of cytochrome C, which is an iron-based protein, as an anti-cancer therapeutic. But as part of this work, we have to actually contextualize what cytochrome C is, why it is important, and focus on the contribution of the metal in this protein. So I've provided everyone with the outline, at least the outline as I see it, and I've consulted with Lewis and a few other people about what could potentially work here. All right, so in this outline, so remember, I'm also going to be an author in this paper, as is Lewis. So not everything will be what you guys write. It will actually be a synergism of what you write in addition to what we contribute. And so this introductory part will be what we're going to work on, and also provide the connective tissue between your guys' section. So this first part is something that Lewis and I will actually establish, which is the significance of developing an anti-cancer therapeutic using a human biomolecule. Okay, so not to say that just because there's a human biomolecule, that means that it's something that is necessarily safe, right? You have to actually understand this molecule to be able to work with it safely. But things to highlight that I think are important is the inherent biocompatibility of this molecule, that there is a well-characterized toxicity associated with this molecule that allows for a smart optimization. So cytochrome C is not something that you necessarily just want a lot of and think that it's not going to hurt you. And that's part of what I have in the outline, is to look at some of the possible toxicity associated with cytochrome C. And something that I'm interested in seeing what you guys find that I might be able to comment on is that this could be a possible route to minimize cell resistance in terms of designing a vehicle combined with a cytochrome C, enabling this. So one team, right? So the class will be divided up into two teams, approximately of 10, no more than 11 people. And so one team is going to focus on this topic number 2, which there's a few subtopics. And again, it is not that every single subtopic will necessarily have something worthy to write about. It's just things that I've come across when I've read on this particular subject. So evaluate the function of cytochrome C in the human body. You have some insight already that Manoj has provided, and also Lewis has given you some of that. All right. So things that could be important, giving some evolutionary insight into this protein in terms of how it's evolved in its function. There are different classes of cytochrome C, so there may be something valuable in talking about the protein and even the heme structure. Discussion of the role of cytochrome C in respiration. That's actually a very important topic. And you will see that there is some literature about the creation of molecules that can mimic cytochrome C. So they're referred to as artificial cytochrome C. Also very important as it relates to a potential to apply cytochrome C, its role in apoptosis. Now this is a programmed cell death, and as part of understanding this programmed cell death, because it is a complexity of systems and proteins that are involved, is defining intrinsic versus extrinsic apoptosis. I will note that apoptosis is not the only way in which a cell can die, but it is a mechanism that people try to trigger, to induce, in an anti-cancer approach. So something that Manoj mentioned was how cytochrome C, when it is released, can induce the formation of what is known as the apoptosome. Okay, so it'd be interesting to explore what are the components of that particular assembly of different proteins. Also, discuss how cytochrome C plays a role in scavenging reactive oxygen species and even reactive nitrogen species, although this topic can also pertain to a different part of this review. And looking at mechanism of suppression of cytochrome C release in cancer normal cells, and particularly in cancer cells, thinking about if this particular protein is effective in triggering apoptosis, well, how can you possibly overcome some of those mechanisms that suppress it in cancer cells? Looking at the role of cytochrome C as a peroxidase. So that's actually really important. Okay, this property that cytochrome C can have, which can lead to a potential health risk of the protein. And so I allude to some literature that may correlate cytochrome C to the onset of neurodegenerative diseases. Right? So it'd be interesting to profile that literature and see what it actually says. Do we agree with it? And because there is the component of the inorganic, to look at the significance of the metal, the iron metal, there have been papers published on metal substitutions. So it'd be interesting to see what was learned about substituting the metal. Was there any insight developed in terms of the function and the structure of this protein, or the structure of this protein? Okay, now the other team will be team number 3, and that team will be tackling the anti-cancer applications involving cytochrome C, and from a few different perspectives. One of them is looking at perhaps a selection, and I would say really be defined here, of anti-cancer drugs that operate by perturbing the mitochondrial membrane, and as a result, they trigger cytochrome C release, because that may be an end goal of using certain types of drugs to trigger cytochrome C, which will enable potentially apoptosis. All right, so looking at that literature, because that's sort of an indirect approach to exploiting the properties of cytochrome C. Focusing on strategies that directly apply cytochrome C. So when I mean directly apply, that you're actually using the molecule. And so again, one of the limitations of the protein is its lack of cell permeability. So as part of this strategy, you have to understand, well, how are they developing this protein in such a way that it can be cell permeable? So in this discussion, there is a room for looking at what I mean by individual treatments with cytochrome C, or combinatorial, perhaps combining the cytochrome C with another drug. And so with those type of combinatorial treatments, there is literature that talks a bit about perhaps a bifunctional system, so working probably as a therapeutic, but maybe even as a diagnostic agent, if that exists, or even as a multifunctional system. Right? So look at that type of literature in terms of the direct application of cytochrome C. And as part of this, and this is where your perspective becomes really important, identify the advantages and disadvantages of each strategy. So at least from my perspective, from what I've seen, and even some of the work that I've been part of with cytochrome C, has been the use of nanoparticles, or the use of soluble proteins or peptides that have been conjugated to the protein. And I've seen advantages of both and also disadvantages. And so, from your perspective, that'd be important to make that a part of your discussion, to see perhaps, having a nanoparticle formulation may give some specificity, but there also could be issues about, well, what happens to the nanoparticle? What's the biologic fate of the nanoparticle? And things like that are really worthy to discuss. And then where I think that we can really provide some information is getting an understanding of multi-drug resistance as related to apoptosis effects, because many chemotherapeutics are limited by cells, cancer cells, tumor cells, becoming resistant to them over time. All right, so getting some understanding of this, the mechanism of apoptotic cell reversibility, that is trying to reverse the cells that are undergoing apoptosis. That is part of a multi-drug resistance mechanism. So how might the drug strategies that you have identified enable overcoming drug resistance, if at all, right? So that's something to think about in this exploration. All right, and I skipped number 4 because number 4 is conclusions, but number 4 is going to depend on the collection of work. So I don't have that collection of work, so I don't want to just make up something. I just that's open for all of us to really contribute to the conclusions. All right, so here are a collection of deadlines. Some of them are hard, some of them are soft that we can play around with the dates. So the first one is on February 18th, where I want the teams to already be defined. So, you know, team 2, team 3 have its corresponding members. So I already have 2 people who have identified teams. So Gemily has volunteered to be in team 2, and I've talked to Vanessa, so she's interested in being part of team 3. Right, so they're our graduate students, so they've divided it up into the 2 different groups. So it'd be nice to see you guys discuss with them and, you know, deciding which team you would like to be part of. All right, so you know, if you can tell me by February 18th, that'd be great, so that we can all get a head start in terms of the subsequent parts of these of this preparation. On March 9th, I want you to prepare a contextualized annotated bibliography of 5 pertinent articles. So again, an annotated bibliography is one in which you're going to give a brief description of the manuscript. So here, I say that you outline the objective, the methodology, and the accomplishments of the work. So in this way, you're already starting to process the information. But also very important is that an annotated bibliography is progressive in that the subsequent entries of your bibliography build off of what you have observed in the previous entry. And that's actually really effective. So let me show you, and I'm actually going to provide you with an example. This was from 2 years ago. So from Valeria Ruiz, when we were writing a manuscript on the novel ligand design and coordination compounds, she was in a team that was focused on the GOLD drug Aranaphen. And so she prepared this annotated bibliography. So she has her reference here. She has her little description about the actual manuscript. She even provides some, you know, perspective of what she found interesting and whatnot. Right. So these were you just heard. I would say that's probably on the longer end. You don't necessarily have to write multiple paragraphs, but maybe 1 or 2 will be very helpful, especially as they build off of one another. One thing that I read everything. So if you're really just going to copy the abstract, I can tell that you copied the abstract. So definitely read the actual articles and provide me your perspective of that article, because I will catch if there's something that you just did based on the abstract of a manuscript. Right? I will provide you this copy of Valeria's annotated bibliography, so you have a reference of a good example. Okay. All right. Another thing that I believe is very helpful, and actually is part of a course that I'm taking myself, I think is quite informative, the impact that it has, is to develop a cycle of care workflow. And so I want this, so whereas the annotated bibliography is individual, each one of you is going to produce your own annotated bibliography, the cycle of care can be done as a teams of 2 or 3. You guys can decide how you want to do that. And here, I will show you my example. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to get out of there. An outstanding approach, but it's just to give you an idea what does it mean. So what I did here was to identify a specific cancer that I was interested for a future grant that I want to write. And I haven't really done this exercise before, at least not in a very formal fashion, but was basically understanding what is the process of a person identifying that they have a certain type of cancer and what is the actual treatment. Because for you to be able to write about whether a certain type of drug is even useful, you need to even understand, well, what is the actual cycle of care involved? And does this drug even have any feasibility of real life application? And so that's something I believe is quite helpful. And so here I developed this for for certain types of leukemia. So you have your acute and your chronic types. And so here I sort of made it a more focus on acute type of leukemia, where I identified that what happens when a patient goes to a doctor and what is the process of that patient being diagnosed with leukemia. So in the case of leukemia, there actually isn't a very clear cut diagnosis that's done. There's sort of a roundabout way of getting there, where you actually have to get your blood work taken, and abnormalities in your blood work may suggest that you have leukemia. And then that progresses to a pretty invasive approach, which is known as a bone marrow biopsy. And in that analysis, that if 20% or more of the bone marrow is made up of cancerous blood cells, then you're defined as leukemia. And the thing is, there are several types of blood cancers. I would say that this is sort of a standard definition of what would constitute as leukemia. But there are some difficulties in really distinguishing one type of blood cancer versus another, the lymphomas as an example. But here I would say this is a pretty defining feature of what would dictate leukemia. And then to identify what are the treatments. And so you may feel like, well, I don't know this. I'm not a doctor. How would I know this? Well, you can actually come across this material from different websites that are cancer-based. So the American Cancer Society provides information. There are different sources that you can use to develop this cycle of care. And what I want you to do is for you to select which type of cancer you're interested in focusing on. I focus on this one, again, building up to my ideas of future grants that I want to write on. So in this context, for this type of cancer, there is a phase known as an induction. And an induction is basically where you're bombarded with treatments. And it occurs in 1 month, especially for acute type of leukemia. So acute myeloid leukemia, that's the one that affects adults. And it's very aggressive. And if not handled right away, can lead to death. And so here you have really prolonged, expensive treatments where you're going through what is known as infusion therapy, where you're getting a number of drugs that are being pumped into your cerebrospinal fluid. And you're talking about blood cells, and really white blood cells. And white blood cells are involved in your immune system. So this will compromise your immune system. So oftentimes you will need antibiotics to help you overcome any possible infections in the process, even blood transfusions, which can bring, as I mentioned to you previously, issues of their own. For people that are higher risk, there are targeted drug therapy and radiation that may help them to be more effective in their battling of the cancer in this induction phase. Once that 1 month mark is reached, the patient undergoes another biopsy, and only when that patient has reached 95% remission, that is, that the basically you have suppressed the amount of the cancer cells by that amount, then you can enter what is known as consolidation. And consolidation occurs in several months, and basically it's the same type of treatment, just not as intense. You're going through infusion therapy, and for some people that are higher risk, you're still talking about a targeted drug therapy, which is very expensive, maybe even a stem cell transplant from perhaps a donor or even from yourself, where what they do is they take the stem cells and they purify it to get rid of any cancerous material, to then put that back into you to foster the formation of more healthy blood cells. Once you overcome that cycle, then you enter maintenance. And unfortunately, maintenance might actually be lifelong. If you look at the leukemia literature, there are suggestions that there is no true cure, although some people have been, quote unquote, cured from it. But maintenance can perhaps be lifelong, like, for instance, diabetes type 2 or any diabetes. So in this context, you're basically getting a lifelong series of treatments, chemotherapy. And so this is a pretty intense, I would say, treatment that one has to undergo. But I think that by preparing something like this, it helps you to give you a perspective of the significance of your work and its value. So I would like for you guys to prepare something like this. and get some insight into the actual treatments, the drugs that are being developed. And again, we'll provide this for you, and we can talk about how you can find material for this. All right, so there is going to be one lecture that we're going to miss in the week of March 22nd and 26th, because I want to leave room for me to have a meeting, Lewis and I to have a meeting with the teams, where we're going to have a discussion, no more than an hour. I don't want to bore you guys, where we look at your annotated bibliographies and we see the common features or things that we find as highlights to brainstorm ideas for your manuscript drafts. So there's quite a bit of distance from when you submit your annotated bibliographies and when we're going to have this meeting. So the understanding is that you will have made more progress in the development of your manuscript. So we would like to hear that progress in that meeting. All right, so we will schedule that with you. So again, when the teams are selected, then you guys will let us know what times you're available to have this meeting. It's going to be virtual, all right? And then Lewis and I will set up that time for you to be able to discuss your progress. On April 15, there will be the rough draft of the manuscript. And so this will allow Lewis and I to evaluate your work and to give suggestions, in terms of the ideas, how effectively they're being conveyed, to talk about perhaps the figures that you might need to make, or even the figures that you may have already included. Then on May 4th, I want to see the completed drafts, because on that date, what's going to happen is you're basically going to exchange drafts so that the other team will serve as your peer review. Okay, so here I will actually be hands off. I will let you guys peer review one another. And again, peer review is supposed to be constructive criticism. You're not supposed to attack one another, right? And as is, you guys are a team. This is something that you guys are compiling together. So the more you can help and really better convey whatever it is that you're trying to say, that's going to make the manuscript even stronger. And then on May 10th is for you guys to submit your peer review evaluation so that you guys can then read from that material and then improve upon your manuscript to then submit the final draft. All right. So that is basically the layout of how we're going to prepare this manuscript in terms of for this review article. Okay. So a few things to note is that the initial part of the course, you're going to have assignments where you are going to write. But as the course progresses, you're going to have less writing of assignments, but more writing focused on the review article. The initial part is for me to get a gauge as to your writing level at this point and to help you to improve. So as I already mentioned to you, based on my evaluation of your actual first assignments, I think everyone is on pretty good ground. There is some issues in terms of paragraph structure where sometimes people just put everything into one paragraph and there's no actual coherency there. And there's also some issues in terms of transitions from one idea to another. But overall, I feel like there was quite effective writing, and I want to see that progress. So that is why at the beginning of the course is a little bit more writing heavy, so that I can help you in really improving any perhaps deficiencies that I see. And I'm not saying that I'm actually writing. We all have room for improvement. But at least from my experience, to be able to help you to be able to say something with much more impact and more concisely. All right. So I already have sent you assignment number 2. And so as part of assignment number 2, it builds up to what will be the first seminar presentation that I'm actually going to give. And so I'll give you a flavor for how I want to facilitate it. And I will be sending you the list of signups for the seminar later today, so that you guys can sign up for seminars according to your preference. So you actually have to rank all the seminars according to your preference, and then based on your preference, I will make the selections of which seminars you are going to give. And so I try my best to give you your top 2 choices, but sometimes I can be a little bit difficult. So at least I try to make one of your top choices be the one that one of the ones that you actually present. So again, if you have any doubts about the manuscript itself, if you haven't received any of the material from that I provided you previously, let me know. because again, there's some email issue, so I want to make sure that you're getting all this material and that you're not missing out on it. There are a few things that I have provided you, so I just want to show you very quickly. I've provided you with this excerpt from a journal, Tips for Writing Better Papers. And it's actually a really effective discussion of different things. Excuse me, I didn't mean to do that. They talk about, what the whole process is of writing. They talk about the cover letter. They really break down all the components of really enhancing the writing process. So I highly suggest that you take a look at this in terms of getting some ideas for writing a manuscript, and also for even making graphics and tables for your manuscript. And it also gives some insight into the peer review process. And something that I actually haven't mentioned, which is using simple but effective words, not to try to be too jargon heavy, because you want to develop this for a broad audience as much as you can. Okay, so that's something that I believe is quite helpful for your development of this manuscript. Okay, and one last thing that I want to show you is the, so I've sent this to you previously, but just if you haven't had a chance to look at it, this is the actual special issue from the Inorganics Journal. So the metal-based anti-cancer drugs. Here you see the 3 people who are actually facilitating this special issue. Okay, and then you can see their description of here where they say, "Dear colleagues," and they talk about what they would like to see. So that's quite helpful to get an idea as to why we're tailoring our article for this particular call. Another really important thing to note is every single journal has information for authors. So obviously the journal has a manuscript so you can get access to, but just to get you familiar with, you can see here there is a section called Instructions for Authors. So every journal has that, and so you can click on that and you see the layout of the instructions of how to prepare your manuscript, the templates, how they want to see figures, the supporting information. So it's very helpful and you must read it. One of the worst things to do is to try to submit a paper and not even listen to any of the guidelines from the actual journal. You will definitely get rejected. Another really important thing is the actual scope of the journal, excuse me. So every journal defines its scope, and so that you have a good idea as to what is it that you're contributing to, if it actually fits. And also very importantly is the editorial board, because these are the people that you initially will write your cover letter to. So you would write, for instance, to perhaps Professor Duncan Gregory. We would write a cover letter to saying that, "Dear Professor Gregory, we are excited to submit our manuscript as part of the special issue," whatever the name of the special issue is, and then we talk about the manuscript. So these are the people, one of these people is who will actually address our cover letter to, and then we will make our recommendations for a possible editor or even a collection of reviewers for our manuscript. So with that in mind, all journals have this information available for us. It's just a matter of us reading the information so that we can prepare ourselves mentally for the construction of our manuscripts. And that would just really make us much more effective in our abilities to do so. All right. Does anyone have any questions about the article itself, the deadlines? So just let me know. Again, you can get on your microphone or you can write a question in the chat room. Okay, Daniela, should the references for the individual annotated biographies be focused on the specific points of the team we select? So it should be focused on some component of that. So once you have you have already joined a team, then you guys should discuss with each other what you want to focus specifically on. So that your annotated bibliography will then focus on that subset of work that you will work on. Okay, so yes, there will be the specific points of the team, but as you already have divided your labor. Okay, Keisha, the references should be in ACS format. It can be in ACS format, or you can even put it into the format of the Inorganics Journal. So you can look at the examples of the Inorganics Journals that I have sent you, some previous examples of the course, or you can click on the instructions for authors, and they will tell you how they want to see the format. So you can use either one. But again, I highly suggest that as soon as possible, as teams, get access to EndNote. As I said, I have access in my lab, so that you guys can use that software in order to be able to have your references and be able to easily format. Okay, other questions? All right, so if there are no other questions, or questions pop up later on, feel free to ask me. I do have my office hours, so remember they're virtual, so just sign in and then we can discuss further. All right, everyone, so let's I will wish you a great day, and let's make this a very exciting manuscript writing process. All right, take care.